By mid-morning, the wind had scraped the sky to its pale bones, and the sand had got into everything. Pantry flour, boot stitching, even the spaces in a man's thoughts. Tom Calder set his shovel into the cut and leaned his weight like he'd done his whole life, shoulder to grain, mind to silence. The windmill on the north pasture had frozen, gearbox cracked in last week's hard freeze, and cattle don't take kindly to promises. So he was opening a hand-dug shaft where the arroyo pinched in, and the cottonwoods drew a darker line across the land. It wasn't smart or modern. It was February in eastern New Mexico in 1957, and there are parts of the world that don't ask for modern if a man can still stand. The shovel bit talked to the ground in its usual language, scrape, crumble, thunk, until it didn't. The sound he hit was clean and quick, a ring that didn't belong to dirt. Bones have a sound if you've lived long enough near heat and hunger and animals that teach without mercy. Tom straightened, let the handle rest, and listened to the wind push against his hat brim. He scraped again with the care you save for something you didn't mean to touch. The ring came back smaller, like the last chime in a church tower when the bellman has already let go. He brushed with his glove. What came up out of the dust wasn't a coin or a bottle, but the rounded curve of something pale and fine, a smooth dome under the soil. That first instant, the mind tells itself anything to keep from telling itself the truth. Turtle shell, cow knuckle, any old thing. Then he saw the shape of an eye orbit, the delicate seam across a tiny skull, like a closed road on a map, and the little shoe beside it. The leather shrunken to a child's ghost of itself, the button hanging on by a thread that a careful hand tied decades ago. He pulled his glove off. The cold air found his skin. He did not touch the bones. Men who have been alone a long time learn to talk to the world without sound. He spoke to the ground, to whatever it had held for this long. I see you, I won't do harm. Then he set his shovel aside, stepped out of the cut, and sat on the rim with his hands on his knees, letting the moment be what it was. The world kept on with its business, the neighbour's windmill clacking faint across the section, a hawk writing its loop, two cows nosing each other in the brittle grass. Nothing about the day was made for what he'd found, and yet here it was, asking him to decide what kind of man he intended to be. He walked to the truck slow so he wouldn't kick up any more dust, drove to the fence line and then back to the house, dust trailing him like a tale he wasn't ready to tell. The kitchen was clean and square, the coffee stale but willing. He lifted the receiver and rang the sheriff's office in Llano Seco. The line clicked twice before a woman answered, her voice like someone who had learned to be kind without wasting anybody's time. Sheriff's office. This is Tom Calder out on County 12 by the Brewer line, he said. I'm digging a well, and I've turned up human remains, small ones. There was a beat where you could hear professionalism catch up to shock. You stay exactly where you are, Mr. Calder, she said. Don't let weather or anything disturb that site. I'll get the sheriff and Dr. Anaya. Don't touch a thing. Tom hung up and stared at his hands like they had something on them. They were clean. He washed them anyway, hard, and then he went back to the cut with 2 stakes and a roll of baling twine. He circled the site with a square and set the stakes, 1 to each quarter, so that even a wind could see there was a line to mind. He took off his hat and stood near the edge, the way you stand when you see something sacred and you don't know the right prayer. The first to arrive wasn't the sheriff, but the neighbor, old Jake Broad, who'd seen the dust from the county road and knew a truck parked where it didn't belong meant either trouble or a story worth having. He dismounted creakingly and came to the edge of the rope with his hat in his hand. Lord, he said simply, seeing the shape in the cut. That's a baby. A child, Tom said, the correction automatic, because calling it a baby made the air go thin in his chest. I called it in. Good, Jake said, and stood there like a man at a graveside who doesn't know the family but knew the weather that day, and claims kinship through that. The sheriff's Plymouth came up the track with careful wheels. Sheriff Ben Reeves was younger than the job by a hair. the kind of man who wore his courtesy like his badge, visible, not flashy. With him was Dr. Louisa Anaya, the county physician, hair pinned tight, eyes that saw the first thing and also the fifth. They stepped to the rope and stopped. The sheriff took off his hat. Dr. Anaya knelt easily, not to touch but to look. "Small," she said softly. 6, maybe 7 years at most. She pointed with a pencil, slow, at the skull. "See that suture? Teeth pattern?" She looked at the little shoe. "Button shoe. Been a long while. The leather says Dust Bowl or earlier." Reeves turned to Tom. "You did right calling. You disturb anything?" "No, sir," Tom said. "Just my piece." "We'll treat it like a scene," Reeves said. "Chain of custody photographs. I know you dug this yourself, but I'm going to ask you not to put so much as a breath more in there than you already have." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Tom said. "Word doesn't walk in small towns. It flies." By the time the deputy had parked at the fence and set up a sawhorse, by the time Dr. Anaya had taken her first notes, and Reeves had run the idea of the name Etta May through his head like a song he couldn't quite place, 3 women from town had come out in a sedan and stood 10 yards off with their hands folded, the way prayer gets done, when fingers are the only part that can move. They didn't speak to the sheriff. They watched the ground. One of them, hair white and long as an apology, lifted a hand toward her throat when she saw the shoe, and made no sound at all. Tom felt the pressure of eyes on him that weren't there. His father, who would have said, "Cover it, boy, it ain't our concern." The preacher, who would have said, "All in God's time." The banker, who would have said, "Don't tangle with the brewers." He felt the weight of a choice he had already made and kept making, to stand between a truth and the machines that grind it. He'd done that once in Korea, when a boy with more stripes than experience had pointed in the wrong direction and told him to go there fast. He didn't go then. He wouldn't now. He stood at the rope and kept the cattle from wandering and accepted a canteen from Jake when it was offered, and he waited for the next right thing. The next right thing, it turned out, was to guard the site through the night. Reeves said the county could spare a deputy until midnight. After that, it was just the dark and the wind, and anything a man could put up against rumor and curiosity. Tom said he'd sit the rest. Reeves studied him a moment and nodded. "All right. If anyone comes raising hell, you call me on Brod's party line. We'll make this proper." Proper was a word that didn't get much range out there except in church and in court. Tom made a small fire off the wind so the ash wouldn't drift. He set a chair just outside the square, and he listened to the land tell its old stories, coyotes arguing with themselves, a nightjar scribbling its name on the dark. He thought of children he had known only in the abstract, as the might-have-been life he didn't seem meant for. He thought of a woman from long ago who had wanted a different kind of cowboy than the one he couldn't help being. He thought of the smallness of what was in the ground and the largeness of the conversations it would wake. Near midnight, tires hummed. A big truck he knew well eased down the track and stopped short of the rope. Hollis Brewer climbed out, tall, well-fed, his father's money set in his jaw. The Brewer outfit owned the section that ran north of Tom's spread. They'd been there since before statehood, collecting acreage, the way other men collect stories. "Evening, Calder," Brewer said, voice oily with friendliness. "Heard there's a hullabaloo out here." "There's a child in the ground," Tom said. "I wouldn't call it that." Brewer peered over the rope, hands in his coat pockets. "Well, that's unfortunate." He glanced at the cottonwoods, at the fence line, at where a map pin would be if you were drawing all this in a ledger instead of walking it with your feet. "You're close to my corner." "Close," Tom said. He kept his hands where Brewer could see them and the fire where the wind liked it. "Sheriff's handling. County docs got it." Brewer rocked on his heels. "I'm sure they do. Still, maybe this is the sort of thing best kept quiet. We've got tourists come out for the canyon in spring now. Folks don't like to hear about remains. Spooks the money. Besides, could be an old Indian grave. They get mean about that." "It's a child," Tom said again, because he needed Brewer to hear it as a fact, not a variable. "And if it's someone's little one from this county, There's a woman out there who stopped sleeping right when this land swallowed her. I'm not going to be the one who tells her to keep waiting." Brewer smiled, the way men smile when they're about to show you a thing they think you don't own. He took a money clip out and peeled a bill. 2, 3. "You're a good hand, Calder. Let me pay for your time. Close that site back up, forget it fell to you, and we'll get a proper crew in summer to move dirt where it won't cause upset. Keep the cattle watered. Keep the tourists happy. That's how it's done." Tom stood. He wiped his palms on his jeans without looking away, in case Brewer mistook politeness for compliance. "You'll put that back in your pocket, Mr. Brewer," he said. "And you'll speak to the sheriff in the morning like any other county citizen. If this happened on your land, you'll answer questions. If it happened on mine, you'll answer differently. But you'll answer either way." Brewer's smile cooled. He slid the money back slow. "You always were a difficult man, Calder." "I sleep good," Tom said. Brewer looked at the square and then at Tom. Something like memory crossed his face. Not guilt, not exactly, but the pinch a man gets when the past tugs his coat. "Dust Bowl years were hard," he said, almost to himself. "People did things then they don't talk about now. Lots of folks lived through hard and didn't throw children into the ground," Tom said. "We'll learn what this is. Or try." Brewer tipped his hat, like a man dismissing a dog he couldn't call off, and drove away, his tail lights shrinking into the dark. Tom sat back down to feed the fire and the night until a grey seam stitched the east. He wasn't a hero. He was a man sitting in the cold doing the next right thing, keep watch, tell the truth, make space for grief to come home. By daylight, half the town had a reason to be on County 12. Dr. Anaya came with a proper team and brushes soft as breath. The ladies from the church brought coffee and not too many questions. Sheriff Reeves set sawhorses and a pad where he wrote down every face and every rumor. And when the bones came up one by one with the reverence a person might use to move hymnals back onto a shelf after a storm, what rose with them was a name, not from the bones exactly, but from the day they had been swallowed. "Etta May," said the white-haired woman from the sedan, voice steady at last. "Etta May Hart. She was 6 in 1936, and she walked off into a dust storm looking for her mama. We looked and we looked, and we never found nothing." She put her hand on the rope like it was a waist-high pew. "I'm Mary Alice Hart. I was 8 then. I am 90 now. That's my sister." No one breathed right for a while. A name makes the air different. It gives shape to sorrow the way a mould gives shape to bread. Tom felt the weight of Mary Alice's years in the tilt of her shoulders and the way her hands curled, not like claws, but like someone holding a bowl to be filled with something worthy at last. "We'll do right by her," he said to Mary Alice, to the bones, to the wind that had lost its temper all those summers ago and calmed down too late. "I'll see to it." He didn't yet know what that meant. He only knew he was making himself responsible for a thing bigger than a well, and that responsibility, once taken, doesn't set down easy. He had no wife at home, no calendar he couldn't tear up, no boss who could threaten a paycheck he didn't take. He had a back that ached, and a sense that the ground had opened to show him not just a child, but a way of being in a place that needed men who could stand. He went home at dusk and slept poorly, and woke with a plan that was more of a posture. Stay at the center of the truth and lean on it until it stands up by itself. He didn't know then he would spend months walking fence lines, not for cattle, but for history. He didn't know he would have to choose between contracts and conscience when Brewer started making calls. He didn't know he would become, against his wishes and in line with his nature, the man who made a map nobody else had thought to make, where the old wells lay hidden, where the land still kept mouths open for the careless and the lost. He just knew, the morning after the day the shovel rang wrong, that a child had come home to her name, and there were chores that belong to the living when the dead finally speak. The sheriff's office took on a hum it didn't much like. Reeves had handled drunken brawls at the roadhouse, boundary disputes with barbed wire and cussing, a bank robbery done with more drama than skill. A child's bones turn a small-town office into something else. Part chapel, part archive, part hinge between people who remember and people who would like not to. Dr. Anaya's findings came in pieces. Age, 6 to 7. Sex, likely female. No obvious traumatic injury to long bones. A crack in the skull consistent with a fall. Soil staining and insect casings suggested the burial had happened when the ground was already dry, then sealed by wind-blown silt. With the shoe were 3 glass marbles clouded with time, and a cheap tin hair clip pressed flat. There was no coffin, no cloth beyond what the soil had eaten, nothing that said ceremony, everything that said accident, or something so close to accident a family could live with it if they had to. Mary Alice came in with a shoebox of papers she'd kept since her mother died, clippings from 1936, a notice tacked once to the feed store header, "Girl missing 6 years." The last family photograph taken the spring before the dust storms turned the sun to a coin. Reeves made copies on the county's temperamental machine and laid the originals back like relics. The picture showed 2 girls in feed sack dresses, one taller with a grin that knew a joke she wouldn't tell, one smaller with a ribbon tied in hair that didn't love to be tamed. The smaller child wore button shoes with scuffed toes and stood with one hand slightly behind her back, like she'd just been caught taking instead of giving and wasn't sure yet whether to run or confess. On the back, in a hand that learned penmanship from a schoolmistress with rules, someone had written Etta May and Mary Alice, July 35th, peach ice at Aunt Lottie's. Tom looked at the picture longer than he meant to. He wasn't family. He wasn't an officer. But he had found the place where the picture ended, and that made him a kind of witness who couldn't just go back to fence repair like none of this had walked into his day. He asked Reeves what came next. "Next," the sheriff said, "I do what I can without a grand jury. For one, I go see Brewer. If this ground was his then, if a hired hand reported something and was told not to, I want that on the record. And I'll open a file formal-like, so if Mary Alice wants a certificate of death that reads like truth, not absence, the state has something to stamp." "You'll need more than talk," Tom said. "Men like Brewer keep words in their pocket like coins." "Then maybe we collect something heavier than talk," Reeves said. Pressure arrived in the way pressure does, suggestions from the Chamber of Commerce that the county shouldn't be morbid. A letter to the editor framed as concern for tourist impressions. A visit to Reeves from a lawyer who wore out-of-county shoes and used my client like a shield. It turned out that in 36 the section line had been a different creature, the surveyors drunk on some days and exacting on others, and the Hoover ditch had been cut by hands who measured distance with strides, not chains. In other words, whose dirt was under Etta May wasn't a line you could point to without argument. Brewer's father had owned north and east. Tom's grandfather had grazed west. The county had let parts go wild and then claimed them back. Brewer came to the courthouse in a suit that made him look more banker than rancher, and sat in Reeves's office with a still face and restless fingers. "My father ran a hard outfit," he said. "Dust Bowl years, families starving. We took on folks when we could, sent them down the line when we couldn't. If a child went missing, God forbid, we looked. I have no recollection of an incident like this, and no one ever reported it to me since I took over." "Your father's foreman back then?" Reeves asked. Brewer named a man now dead 10 years. "Sanchez handled the migrant families day to day. He'd have told my father if... Well, I can't say." "You can say whether there were open shafts," Reeves said. "Old cisterns, test wells?" Brewer hesitated. "We sunk a number in 35 and 36. It was dry as a sermon then. Some we capped when they were sour. Some blew in. You do what you can with wind and time." "And you kept records?" Brewer looked not at Reeves, but at the wall clock. "Not like you mean." "I'm not heartless, Sheriff. Whoever that child was, it's a mercy she's found. But I won't have my family name dragged for what wind and drought did to everyone. You put that on me, we'll have trouble." "It's already on you," Reeves said, not unkindly. "On me, too." On the county, on men who let holes stay open and called that an inevitability. We'll keep it fair. Brewer left with his coat over his arm and a promise to have his lawyer send a letter that would say nothing with many words. Reeves swiveled his chair and looked at Tom, who had sat against the far wall with the patience to be furniture when law needed quiet. You meant it when you said you'd see to it? I meant it, Tom said. Not the court part. You're built for that. I'm built for a different chore. What chore is that? Looking, Tom said. Not for bones, for mouths in the ground. Every rancher in this county has old wells and test holes and cisterns gone to memory. Some are marked, some aren't. The county'll take years and tender money to do a survey. I can do it with a notebook and a coil of rope and a pair of eyes. Reeves rubbed his jaw. You want to do that on your own dime? On my own time, Tom said. Dime I have less of. What'll Brewer say if you go walking his back pastures? I'll ask permission where I can, Tom said. Where I can't, I'll stand on the public side of a fence and mark what I can see. You ever notice how a stand of weeds grows different where there's a hole under? Land telegraphs if you listen. Dr. Anaya heard them and stepped into the door with that look she got when science and sorrow braided. If he does it, she said to Reeves, what you end up with is a map. Maps change how people behave. Names do too. Mary Alice needs a certificate and a grave. The next mother needs a county that caps its wells. Reeves leaned back. The ceiling fan ticked. Outside, courthouse steps held a cluster of men, comparing troubles, as if they could barter them. All right, Calder, Reeves said. You make your map. Bring it here when you have a page. I'll call a commissioners' meeting and see if we can find money for caps and rebar. Tom bought a notebook from the hardware store, with paper thick as old sermons, and drew a grid of the county, sections and lines, arroyos, windbreaks, and the roads that were roads, and the ones that were merely ambitions. He started on his own land, because a man ought to clean his house before he judges a neighbour's. He found 2 old hand-dug test holes near the dry stock pond that he'd filled years ago with rock and scrap and thought were safe. One had settled. He remounted it with gravel and welded a cross-hatched lid from a cattle panel, wired it to T-posts, and marked it on the map. He walked the Brewer fence, not to trespass but to look, found the telltale collapse where a badger had made a home where a well-throat had been, and a depression like a shallow grave that proved on probing to be just the land thinking aloud. He wrote it down. He fetched a rope, a headlamp, and a neighbour, Jake, to hold the line on the ones that needed eyes. You don't go into the ground without a man watching your back, and Tom had seen enough holes in Korea not to romanticize them. Word spread in a kinder direction too, people called. We got an old cistern behind the cottonwood that the kids throw rocks at. Grandad says there used to be a well under the hog pen, but he capped it with boards and dirt when he quit hogs. There's a sink on the far side of Trujillo's, where the grass grows greener. Might be a spring. Might be a problem. Tom went. Sometimes he found nothing but stories. Sometimes he found a mouth you could have lost a steer in. He marked them all, built lids where he could, pestered the county when he couldn't. He talked a welder into giving him scrap cheap and a class of high school boys into helping on Saturdays. You want to be men? This is a kind of man, he told them, which sounded corny even to him, but they showed up. He let them write their initials under the steel where no one would see. They grinned like they'd carved their names in a tree they promised not to cut. Brewer tried to make him stop with insults first, glory hound, with offers second, consult for me and I'll pay, with threats third, you step on my property and I'll have you arrested. Tom stayed on his side of the fence and kept his voice level. I'm not at war with you, Hollis, he said once at the feed store, while men pretended to buy nails and listened. I'm at war with holes. Same thing, Brewer muttered, and left with feed he didn't need. Mary Alice visited the site when the coroner released it, and then she came to the cemetery on a mild day in March when the sky had decided to be generous. The stonecutter had been careful. No angels, no lies. Just a name, 2 dates with a 36-year desert between, and a line that made both bearable, found. People came who remembered her mother's biscuits and the way Etta May had liked to hide behind the feed sacks and say boo. The pastor said little. Tom stood under a live oak near the back and watched grief do its slow, necessary work. Mary Alice caught his eye as she left and pressed something into his hand. It was the tin hair clip, straightened, polished, the cheap metal shining like it thought it was better than it was. "You keep that, Mr. Calder," she said. "You reminded the county my sister had a name." He put the clip on a nail by the door at home, next to the bridle he used when he wanted a horse to listen, and the photograph of a young man in uniform no one would ever call a hero except his mother. He didn't talk to it. He let it talk to him when he forgot what he was for. The map grew, penciled circles, crosshatches where caps went on, exclamation marks where the county needed to spend money, little skull and bones doodles the high school boys added when they thought he wasn't looking. "Doctor." Anaya asked to make a copy to tape in the clinic, and Reeves asked for one to bring to the commissioners. The local paper ran a story with a picture of Tom looking at the ground, which is what men like Tom are always doing. The article was respectful and plain. "Calder says, we don't have to lose another one." That was the quote. He hadn't meant it to be a motto. It became one. The commissioners voted money for caps with little speeches about responsibility that played well in the minutes. The county ordered rebar and mesh and sent out a memo with a title too formal to live. Public Safety Initiative for Legacy Well Mitigation, and a line at the end that made Tom smile because he heard a voice he recognized in the syntax. "If you've got a hole, call Tom Calder." Reeves had written it. The clerk left it in. Not everyone was grateful. A rancher out east said government meddling came in like a snake. First, it's your wells. Next, it's your water. Next, it's your land. Tom listened without arguing. "I'm not the government," he said. "I'm your neighbor. You got a hole that can take a child. You cap it. If you won't, I will, and you can be mad at me for the good reason instead of the bad one." A month later, that same rancher's colt fell into a test hole that hadn't been there in anyone's memory. Tom and Jake worked 4 hours with boards and rope to get it out. The colt staggered into daylight, shook like a dog, and looked offended. The rancher put his hat in his hands and then on his head like a man stepping into a new habit. "Leave your map with my wife," he said, voice rough. "I'll quit being a damn fool." Brewer fought all of it with lawyers until the thing turned stupid because he'd clearly rather be right than decent. But then a letter surfaced from the 30s, a page torn from an old ledger in a box at the courthouse that nobody had thrown away because small counties only throw away what they trip over. It was a notice to the Brewer outfit from the Works Progress Administration, reminding them to cap hand-dug test wells near the Hoover Ditch. A foreman had signed receipt. Reeves showed it to Brewer, not like a weapon, but like a mirror. "I'm not charging your daddy with anything, Hollis," he said. "I'm telling you a truth you can choose to ignore or not. Don't be him where you have a choice not to be." Brewer blinked. He looked tired all at once, like a man who'd been keeping his teeth clamped on a story that no longer needed to be told. "All right," he said. "All right, Calder. Make your damn map on my land. Send me the bill for the steel. I'll pay it. I won't like it." "You don't have to like it," Tom said. "You just have to do it." By summer, the map hung in the courthouse like an odd sort of art. Black lines over cream paper, a lattice of caution and care. Beside it, Reeves had tacked up Mary Alice's clipping from 36 and the new article about the grave. The two pieces of paper talked to each other across a distance that hurt to look at and healed something when you did. Children came to the courthouse with their mothers to renew tags and stood on tiptoe to touch the glass. "What's that?" they asked. "That's where we don't fall," their mothers said. Tom didn't set out to be a hero. He set out to water cattle and mind his own business. The world had other plans. which is usually how these things happen. He ate beans and tortillas, he fixed his windmill when the county's cap budget paid him less than the work cost, and he came home at night with the kind of tired that doesn't breed complaint. When the boys from the high school graduated in May, they presented him with a cheap plaque they'd pooled coins to buy. It read, "Tom Calder, Well Finder." He hung it under the hair clip. He thought both were too much and exactly right. Some evenings he drove out past the cemetery and sat with his boot heels in the dust just to hear the quiet. He didn't talk to Etta May. He talked to the windmill, to the fence posts, to the kind of God one can stand beside without a sermon. He let himself imagine that the world, now that it knew a name, would be less careless with its holes. He knew better. But a man deserves a little foolishness to carry him into the next day. In June, a tourist family pulled over by the cottonwoods, the kids pointing at the cap with the welded mesh and the warning sign, "Danger, Opening," like it was a roadside attraction. The father squinted at the map tacked on the county notice board there and said, "Huh, that's good." He lifted his boy by the underarms and said, "See, people take care." Tom stood off where no one saw him and let the sentence be what it was. Not gratitude, not exactly, but acknowledgement. It's enough. He had one more chore to do that summer, a chore that would make folks call him a hero to his face and in the paper and in ways he didn't know what to do with. He didn't want the word. He wanted water for cattle, and a night without someone knocking on his door handed him a problem he couldn't refuse. He wanted, perhaps most of all, to not be the man who sat a long night by a rope around a square and watched the dark think. But he had found a child where the ground kept a mouth, and that had made him into someone the county needed. Sometimes a name makes you, sometimes the work does. Sometimes a wind-blown morning knocks the old you down a well, and the new you climbs out holding a map. The commissioners put legacy well mitigation public safety fourth on their July agenda after county weed ordinance update and before auction of tax delinquent property. That was the sort of bureaucratic comedy the townsfolk understood and endured. The room smelled like floor polish and coffee. Reeves spoke softly, saying what needed saying without burning anyone's pride. Dr. Anaya talked about bones and absence and how prevention is the only noble medicine. Mary Alice stood up when no one had asked her to and told the room what her mother did the day after the dust storm. Baked biscuits and set one on the windowsill for Etta May, as if the smell could pull her home, and then never baked biscuits again. When folks tell truths like that, money gets found. The commissioners voted another $3,000 and a letter to the state asking for matching funds. The clapping was subdued in the way gratitude is when it shares a room with regret. Tom sat in the back and didn't clap. He took off his hat and put it in his lap and watched paper turn into will. He had his own paper ready. Not a speech, a list. He stood at the end because men like him always stand at the end, and said quietly, "I have 27 openings marked in the northwest quadrant, 13 in the east, 24 depressions likely to blow in by fall. I can show any man who wants to see. I could use help on caps, though. If you've got a welder and a Saturday, I'll put you to work." He didn't expect what happened next. Luke Moreno, who'd come home from Denver after a divorce and a year of drinking himself dangerous, raised his hand. "I weld," he said, "and I could do with a Saturday where my hands are doing something worth a damn." Then old Mrs. Trujillo said she'd make tamales for anyone who worked. Then Polly from the diner said she'd send jugs of tea. Then the football coach said he'd bring the boys, and maybe they'd learn this is what strength is for. Then Brewer, late, coat over his arm again, eyes less tired now, cleared his throat and said, "I'll send Steele." If there was a moment when the county changed its mind about itself, that might have been it. Not the vote, not the grave, not even the map, but the head-nodding, purse-opening, chore-listing alchemy of a place, deciding that it would no longer call avoidable things inevitable. What Tom did next wasn't dramatic, that's the point. He scheduled Saturdays like a foreman schedules harvest cruise. He made stacks of lids from rebar and mesh, measured to fit the mouths they'd learned. He taught Luke how to stitch corners so a boot wouldn't catch. He put the high school boys on the augers and showed them how to listen to the earth with the soles of their shoes. He listened to wives talk about husbands who'd fallen into holes of a different kind and didn't come back, and he didn't rush the stories out of the shade. He also did a thing nobody had asked him to do. He went to the school board with Dr. Anaya and asked to speak to 4th and 5th graders in the fall. You teach fire safety. You teach to look both ways. You teach stranger danger now, he said to a principal whose hair had gone white managing budgets. Teach them not to go into arroyos in a storm, not to climb into holes, to call a grown man when they see a depression where the grass grows green. The principal said yes, because the day hadn't yet taught him to say no. Tom stood in front of rows of children who smelled of chalk and peanut butter and said, "You'll see things the rest of us miss. That's a gift. Use it." He held up the tin hair clip and told them a story without tremble or flourish, and the children were quiet in the way only children can be when they feel a story take its chair. The paper came out and called him a hero. The headline was too big, and the words sat wrong in his mouth like a strawberry seed. He didn't refuse interviews. He just answered short. "Why'd you do it?" a young woman from the Albuquerque station asked, lipsticked, tired from the drive. "Because I was there," he said. "Because I had a shovel. Because I have a back that still works and a conscience that won't shut up." "What do you want people to take from this?" she pressed. He looked past her lens out the window, where a boy pushed his bike with a flat tire and his little sister argued with a sign about ice cream. "That you cap your holes," he said. "All of them." He lost some business. Men who didn't like other men telling them where their fences failed found reasons not to hire him for day work. He didn't starve. Others hired him to walk their back acres like a dowser of danger. Brewer, to his weary credit, paid for steel on the holes Tom marked and kept his mouth shut about the headline. Reeves found himself sleeping better and not knowing why, until he realized the night noises had shifted from coyote to train, and trains don't carry the kind of dread a small boy can fall into. In late August, a thunderhead built itself on the rim of the world and came pacing across the grass with the deliberate feat of something that believes itself inevitable. The arroyo flashed brown and heavy, a half-hour of hard rain in 2 minutes. A family from back east had stopped in the wrong low place. 2 kids climbed out and ran as water unrolled its argument. They veered toward a depression in the mesquite, just a shallow bowl, where a man once thought he'd sink a well and didn't. The county had put a cap on it in June. The kids scrambled up and over the mesh and kept running. Their father pulled them into the truck bed, and there they stayed, water to their knees, fear to their eyes, until the storm remembered it wasn't God. Later, at the cafe, the mother told the story with a tremble that made Forks stop. "There was a metal thing in the ground," she said, hands sketching the height of it. "It looked ugly. It saved my kids." Tom heard about it 2 days later. He didn't smile. He felt something uncoil from around his ribcage that had been there since February. He drove out to the cap, not to admire it, but to set his hand on the crosshatch and feel the heat it had stored. Steel remembers. So do men. Mary Alice came by his place with a jar of peaches she'd put up herself, the defeat of 36 finally unhooked from her wrists. "I'd done my biscuits again," she said. "Turns out I didn't forget." She looked at the hair clip on the nail. "You keep that a while longer," she said. "When you're done needing to see it, you give it back." "What if I never stop needing to see it?" he asked. "Then you keep it forever," she said. "We can share that kind of forever." School started. The football boys got mud on their jeans and pretended they didn't cry when Coach read them the article about the cap and the kids in the storm. The county put a line in its budget labeled "well caps," as ordinary as paperclips and as noble as bridges. The map on the courthouse wall got dots of red in the margins where they were still to go, and dots of blue where they were done. A child drew a picture in crayon of a round hole with an X over it and gave it to Tom without introduction at the grocery. He put it on his fridge with a magnet, shaped like a horse. Brewer came around in a way that would never make the paper, because that's not what men like him let out in public. He sent a man with a receipt book to pay for a quarter of the caps county-wide, signed Brewer outfit with a hand that tried not to look like his. He didn't ask for a tax write-off letter. He didn't do it twice. It was enough. The following spring, the state sent a man to shake hands. "This is good work," the man said. "We'll tell Santa Fe you're a model." Tom nodded and didn't put on his good shirt. The man asked for a photograph in front of the map, and then asked him to hold a novelty-sized check for the camera. Tom held it like it was a sleeping cat and put it down careful when they told him he could. He was tired by then. Of praise, not the work, of the way the word hero reduces and inflates a man at the same time, of the people who only listen if your name is typed in a font larger than the rest of the page. He slept that night. In the morning, he saddled his bay and rode the fence line that separates his world from what isn't. The cottonwoods wore new leaves like a decision. The arroyo had made a fresh cut in the bank where last week's storm had thought about ambition. He dismounted where he dug that first wrong-sounding shovel and stood there a while. The square was gone. The rope was gone. There was only ground, level as you could want. He put his palm down flat like a blessing. Not because he believed in that kind of magic, but because a man can make a gesture even if it only changes the man. He thought of Etta May, of the shoe button, the marbles, the hair clip. He thought of Mary Alice baking biscuits again. He thought of the two kids who had run across steel and lived to tell it badly and wonderfully to their own kids someday. He thought of how a place teaches you slowly what you owe it, and how sometimes it takes a shock to make you say yes. On the ride back he saw something he'd taught himself to see, a patch where the grass splayed outward in a circle, and the soil packed down wrong. He swung down, probed with his boot heel and felt hollow. He marked it with a flag and chalked it on the map later in the kitchen by the hair clip and the plaque. It wasn't a big hole. It would have taken a small boot, though. He'd cap it on Saturday. By fall, the county had a statistic it could put in a grant, and a story it could put in a school assembly, and a grave with flowers that never lacked a hand to set them. People still fell in other kinds of holes. They always will. But in Llano Seco, there were fewer mouths in the earth a child could step into and not be seen. If you want to call that heroism, fine. Tom called it chores. "Why'd you keep at it?" a boy asked him in October after he'd finished a talk, and the teacher had said, "One last question." The boy's hair stuck up like a thistle. His shoelace was untied. He would be wholly himself someday if the world let him. "Because I found what we lost," Tom said. "And when you find what's lost, your next job is to keep someone else from losing it the same way." He didn't say destiny, or calling, or providence. Those words are too gold for a man who likes the color of rust. He said, "Keep your eyes open. If you see a place that looks like it could swallow a small thing, tell someone big. If you're the big one, be bigger." On the first cold day of November, Mary Alice knocked on his door. He let her in. She sat at his table while he poured coffee so weak she asked him for another scoop for the pot. He obliged. "I've brought you something," she said, and pushed an envelope across. Inside was Etta May's ribbon, pressed in a book so long it had gone flat without losing its red. "You can hang that by the hair clip," she said. "I told you we'd share the forever." He did, and when he sat alone after she left, the ribbon moving slightly in the draft, no one else would notice. He allowed himself the luxury of a feeling he doesn't indulge often, pride that leans toward joy and not arrogance. He thought, not for the first time, that a man can spend his whole life in a county and only at the end learn its true size. He smiled at the idea that truth is measured not in acres or cattle, but in holes covered and names spoken. The wind knocked once at the door, like an old friend who no longer needs to be invited. He went to bed with the kind of tired that guarantees sleep, and the kind of peace that doesn't brag. The next morning he'd mend a fence, and Saturday he'd weld a cap, and Sunday he'd stand by a grave and listen to two sisters talk about biscuits while the cottonwoods did what they've done since before men were measuring anything: hold a piece of sky in place so the rest of us don't forget what steadiness looks like.